Welcome to Herdley. The book is distilled into 3 stories, giving you the key ideas in minutes. Today we listen to Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, in which we probe into the historical decline of violence and its cultural causes, the role of empathy and reason in reducing aggression, the impact of the rights revolutions on modern peace. Steven Pinker is one of the most influential intellectuals in the Western world today. Don't go away. Herdley the editor will be right back. Today, we'll dive into 3 stories that reveal the incredible journey of humanity, from its violent past to a more peaceful present, all through empathy, reason, and the rights revolutions. These stories speak of conflict, transformation, and hope, giving us lessons on how we can continue down this path of peaceful coexistence. The first story takes us back to the time when violent tribal conflicts dominated human existence. Imagine a small, ancient society where the cycle of vengeance ruled. One man, who had witnessed his family's brutal slaughter in a tribal raid, took revenge on the attackers. The initial violence set off a series of retaliations that spanned generations, with each side believing their cause was just. In one particularly devastating episode, nearly the entire village of men, women, and children was wiped out in a raid led by the original Avenger's grandson. This tale reflects the endless cycle of violence that defined early human societies. The pattern of revenge and honor killings was deeply ingrained in these societies, passed down like an inheritance from generation to generation. But what broke this cycle? Over time, the rise of centralized governments, legal systems, and trade networks helped to replace personal vengeance with institutional justice. As legal frameworks took root, people began trusting a higher authority to resolve conflicts instead of taking matters into their own hands. This shift not only lowered violence, but also paved the way for civilizations to thrive in peace. As Pinker notes in the book, as governance expanded, the Leviathan's monopoly on violence reduced private feuds. This story teaches us the importance of strong institutions that offer justice, thereby breaking the cycle of revenge. From this world of constant feuding, we move to the Age of Enlightenment, where empathy began to reshape the human conscience. Picture a man sitting in a Parisian salon in the 18th century, engaging in a heated debate on the abolition of torture. This man, influenced by emerging ideas of reason and human dignity, argued passionately against state-sanctioned cruelty. The practice of public executions and torture had long been accepted as both entertainment and punishment. Spectators would gather in town squares to witness gruesome acts, from floggings to burnings at the stake. The suffering of others was normalized, until slowly, something shifted. Philosophers like him began to challenge the morality of such acts, spreading the radical notion that all humans, even criminals, deserved dignity. The change did not happen overnight, but as these ideas of empathy spread, they began to shape laws and customs. Leaders in various European nations began abolishing torture and capital punishment, culminating in a broader movement for human rights. As Pinker captures, the abolition of state cruelty marked the rise of empathy in the public sphere. The shift from barbarism to empathy-driven justice shows us that change is possible when the human mind is open to seeing others' suffering as its own. Institutions followed this lead, implementing reforms that valued life over revenge. But this wasn't the end of the journey. Empathy would later extend beyond criminal justice into new domains. The final story is set in the mid-20th century, amidst the waves of civil rights movements sweeping across the globe. This era gave rise to the rights revolutions, where minority groups, once silenced and oppressed, began to fight for their place in society. Take, for instance, the story of a young African-American woman who grew up in the segregated South, where violence against her community was common and often ignored by the law. She witnessed the lynching of a close friend's father, a scene that scarred her deeply. Despite the systemic violence, she eventually joined the civil rights movement, risking her life to march for equal rights. Through years of protest and sacrifice, changes began to take root. Discriminatory laws were overturned, voting rights were granted, and racial violence was prosecuted at the national level. The rights revolutions didn't just stop at race. Women's rights, gay rights, and animal rights followed in the decades to come, reshaping society's understanding of equality. These revolutions were fueled by a growing sense of justice, backed by empathy and reason. People who were once marginalized found their voices, and the state's monopoly on violence began to extend protection to all its citizens. This era cemented the idea that governments exist to protect, not oppress. As Pinker observed, the 20th century saw a surge in movements that expanded the moral circle. The lessons here are clear. Sustained activism, grounded in empathy and reason, can lead to systemic change. And as we push forward, these rights continue to evolve, challenging us to reflect on who else we can include in our moral circle. So, from the ancient tribal conflicts that were tamed by governance, to the rise of empathy in the Enlightenment, and finally the rights revolutions of the 20th century, each story has something to teach us about the path to peace. The thread that connects them all is the human capacity for empathy, reason, and the belief that progress is possible when we look beyond ourselves. In each instance, we see that peace isn't achieved overnight. It's a long process, driven by our better angels. As the editor of Herdley, through these stories, we can learn that the future of peace lies in continuing to broaden our moral circle, pushing for systemic justice, and using reason as our guiding force. Each story comes from the most representative real-life cases selected by the Herdley team from this book. Beyond these, there are more than a dozen other powerful stories of human progress that make this book worth reading. If you wish to dive deeper, we recommend purchasing the full book. Finally, share a sentence from the book to end today's reading. Empathy. As we draw to a close, let's circle back to the key ideas from today's reading. The historical decline of violence, the growing influence of empathy and reason, and the transformative power of the rights revolutions. These themes have reshaped societies, pulling us away from barbarism and into an era of greater peace and justice. One striking story comes from the aftermath of World War II. As the world reeled from unprecedented devastation, many believed humanity had reached a point of no return. However, a remarkable shift occurred during the Nuremberg trials, where leaders of the defeated Nazi regime were held accountable for war crimes. For the first time in history, rather than seeking revenge through mass executions or further war, the victors chose to pursue justice through a legal process. The Nuremberg trials established the foundations of international law and set a precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity. This approach was not only unprecedented, but also marked a significant moment where reason and justice prevailed over the instinct for vengeance. As Pinker writes, "Justice, not revenge, became the cornerstone of post-war peace." The story of Nuremberg exemplifies how reason, guided by empathy, can lead to lasting peace even after the most horrific violence. Through these examples, we see that the decline in violence is not a fluke, but a product of deliberate human progress. By reflecting on these stories, we understand that our journey toward peace is ongoing. Through empathy, reason, and justice, we can continue